This morning, Wesley was planning on speaking. And then, of course, remember he and Alexis and Wesley's family, he's gone to Jackson, Mississippi for the funeral of his aunt, which was yesterday, and then we'll be headed back today. But Wesley told me a few of the things he was thinking about saying when we talked about this week. And so I'm going to steal a few of his ideas. And you may wish that Wesley was presenting them, not me. We'll see. There's so much packed into this passage, which we recognize is parallel to the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus says in Matthew. But I want us to see at least a few things and maybe kind of an overall picture. The reading begins in verse 27. Jesus says, "But I say to you who hear." And Wesley said, when we were talking about the passage, he said, I really want to focus on that, the difference between hearing and listening. Kind of like Jesus is saying, a lot of you are here hearing the actual words I'm saying, but I'm talking to those of you who are actually listening. I think that's a good distinction. Is that something that Jesus kind of was getting at? Some of you have ears to hear. Some of you have eyes to see. You're really paying attention. And I think we do with this kind of passage. As I suggested last week when we looked at the verses that followed, that were just previous to this, and today's following on with our lectionary reading, I said last week, we have to not take this so much literally as we need to take it seriously. And it holds true again this week. Because if we think about it very literally, you say, okay, Jesus says someone who strikes you on the cheek, you must turn the other cheek. And then I often hear people start giving a hypothetical. So is Jesus saying that if someone is breaking into my home, threatening my wife and children, that I just have to let and what they do is throw out a hypothetical situation, which is absurd in terms of who would not try and protect the vulnerable. And then because Jesus appears to be saying, don't do anything to defend those who are vulnerable, then they dismiss the passage, which I can understand wanting to dismiss the passage, because if that's what Jesus is talking about, I have no way of making sense of it. And they're taking it so literally that they don't know a way to take it other than he seems to be saying things that, seem morally incompatible with loving my neighbor, because after all, isn't my wife and children my neighbor as well? And how can I love them if I just allow harm to happen? So let's put that aside. Let's avoid the temptation to kind of think of hypothetical situations that then lead us to say, I don't know how to take anything Jesus is saying in this passage. Let me suggest that he's speaking figuratively, he's giving examples, but what he's talking about we need to take seriously, and we have to listen in such a manner so as to get to the point he's taking, that he wants us to get to, what he wants us to take from it. Now, just about that slap part, because it is a slap, right? It very specifically says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, okay, let's say you're standing in front of someone, you're looking at each other, and most people are right-handed. How will you have to strike them so as to hit their right cheek? You can't punch them because you'd punch them in the nose, right? How do you hit their right cheek if you're looking at them? You backhand them, right? It's a slap of insult. Jesus, for starters, if we're taking him seriously, he's not talking about take no action if someone is trying to do you harm. This is not talking about assault. This is talking about insult. Because actually the Jewish law would hold you accountable if you struck someone in such a manner as to punch them. But you could insult them and get away with it, right, if you're a legalist, right? There wasn't the same penalty for simply insulting. So for starters, when we really start looking at what Jesus is saying, I think we start to realize, okay, this isn't suggesting the unconscionable, like what doesn't make any sense, and I can't, morally say, let's do that. He's talking about how do you deal with insult? How do you deal with a person who belittles you, who dismisses you? What do you do about that? He's not so much talking about physical harm, but That's just putting that little piece in context. But let's look at the passage as a whole, as it's given to us in our reading 27 through 38. It's all about loving your enemies, right? Because that's where it starts, verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. But he revisits that back down, all the way down in verse 35, as he's talked about a lot of things in the interim. He comes back to verse 35, but love your enemies. So everything here has to do with loving those who are our enemies, okay? Now, some of the points he makes are things like, well, this is for Christians the standard that matters because everyone else loves their friends, does good to those who do good to them. But we've got to rise to another level in terms of what it means for us to be those who are in harmony with the ways of God. And that only comes about when we love our enemies. And he makes that clear because the way the passage ends, Jesus says, this is definitely what God does, right? So verse 35, but love your enemies, as he's concluding this section, and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High. You will be the children of God. Because now we're talking about being the children of God, not by the nature of our creation. We're all the children of God. God has created us. Who else? Whose children would we be except of our Father who made us? But now he's talking not about children of God by creation, but children of God by behavior, those who imitate God, being his children. And Jesus says to those listening, you become the children of God when you love your enemies. Why? For he himself, the last part of 35, is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Because this is what God does. I like how the enemies are defined here as ungrateful people. See, the passage is not talking about mortal enemies, right? Mortal enemies are those who threaten perhaps my very life. Now, it does include them, but sometimes we might think, I don't have any enemies. I don't think anyone's out to kill me, right? And you might think, well, how can I have any enemies? How do I read this passage? Well, the way enemies is defined in this passage, it's as simple as someone who's ungrateful. And that's not particularly being mean to you or something, but boy, isn't it difficult to deal with people who are chronically ungrateful? Like you give and you help and you're there, and then they never even say thank you. And sometimes they complain, right? That it wasn't enough. And you're thinking, I have expended a lot in terms of trying to help you, and you haven't said thank you, and now you said, well, just this, no more, right? But Jesus says, God, his Father, is kind even to those who don't thank him. In Matthew, it says he sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. And the rain here is a blessing. It's not a metaphor for trouble. Rain now is what causes your crops to grow in the fields. And he generously gives the same rain to everyone. So Jesus is saying, the reason we need to love our enemies is because this is the way of God, and if we're not doing it, we're not children of God. Plain and simple. Not talking about you're condemned to eternal torment, just simply saying in terms of your actions, you are not yet acting like your Father, right? And so sometimes we have to hear that and think, oh, yes, so when I harbor resentments and when there's people I just can't stand and don't like, and there's plenty of places in our world now to do that, right? There's a lot of enmity in our world. And as much as I join in with that, I'm not a child of God. Because God is not saying, be like me and hate those who are doing wrong. Because God doesn't. He's kind to the ungrateful and to the evil. And then finally, he says, be merciful in 36, just as your Father is merciful. So love here has to do with mercy. Love has to do with kindness. That should not be surprising, right? Paul says love is kind, right? Love is merciful. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love is patient. All the things that we know from 1 Corinthians 13. So that's what Jesus is talking about, loving our enemies. And I'm suggesting that this is about how we overcome, right? How do we overcome? What does overcoming look like? Well, here in verse 35, where he's talking about what God does, do good. Reminds me of what Paul says in Romans 12, where he says, do not repay evil for evil, but we overcome evil with good. The whole formula of Jesus, the Christian ethic, is when people are at their worst, we must rise up and be at our best, right? When they're hateful, when they're ungrateful, when they're evil, we have to rise up and not respond to them in kind or participate in what they're doing, and not in a haughty way, thinking of ourselves as superior, but in a genuinely loving way, say, I'm going to love no matter what. I'm not going to let my love be diminished by someone else's attitude or action. I just can't let that happen. I'm tempted to let that happen, right? I want to repay in kind. I sure do. I want to do eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, right? I would much prefer to do that. I want to hurt those who hurt me. That's my fleshly, natural kind of, natural not in the sense of how I was created, but in the sense of my kind of habitual behavior. That's what I want to do. But Jesus is instructing us to do something different. So the love of enemies is the imitation of God. Notice all the ways in which he describes enemies here. He talks about it as those in 27 who hate you. He talks about it in 28 as those who curse you, which means, kind of wish ill upon you. I don't know that it always means just, swearing at you. It certainly includes that. That'd be a form of experiencing hate. But I always think of curse now in terms of my experience in Africa, how cursing is this kind of inciting of black magic to bring down some sort of, crisis or tragedy on someone. And I think that's probably more of what it meant in Jesus's culture. To curse is to, try and appeal to the divine beings to rain down horror and terror. So people are wishing God to do you harm. He says those are your enemies, the people who do that. 29, the slap, those who insult you. Also in 29, those who take from you, who would take. Verse 34, those who won't repay. Verse 35, the ungrateful and the evil. So that's a good enough list for us all to say, okay, maybe I do have some enemies. There's people in this world who wish me ill, who insult me, who are ungrateful. And in Jesus' way of looking at it, those are all your enemies. Those are the people who make your life difficult, who are hard to deal with. And sometimes they're more actively and sometimes just neglectfully abusive to you. And Jesus says, but here's the call. We got to figure out how to love in spite of that. We have to overcome what they're doing with love. So he gives a bunch of examples here. These include, as I look through the passage, kind of no paying back in kind, no revenge, that sense of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But like he says in verse 31, which is the golden rule, treat others the same way you want them to treat you. In other words, what I have to do is I have to stop thinking about who they are and how they're behaving and want to respond to their behavior. And I need to think about what would be what I would like and then do that, irrespective of what they're doing. I mean, it's in some ways such a simple standard, treat them the way you would want to be treated. And yet we all know, boy, is that hard to do. Maybe it's just me, but I'll confess, I find that hard to do. It's often hard to even stop and think, what would I like someone to do for me? Not what I want to do because of how they behave toward me, but just how would I want to be treated? He's giving that as a practical measure of love. He talks about it as being merciful in verse 36. He talks about this overcoming love as not judging and condemning, but rather forgiving. That's a pretty good list through these verses of how we can overcome through the practice of love. Now, one of the things that I notice is he's talking about actions that I can do. He's not really talking about how I feel in my heart. And I'm not excusing when I don't feel good in my heart. But if the standard were, you have to feel really good about these folks, I'm sorry, I don't think I could ever be a disciple. Right? I find it too hard to just like force myself by will or by, effort to like the unlikable, to enjoy those who are ungrateful, right? But that's not what he's talking about. He's not holding up that kind of standard. He's saying what you have to try and do is act in kind ways and really trying to treat them with kindness. And I think sometimes what we find happens is when we do that, our heart tends to soften towards those people with whom we've been angry. Maybe it doesn't go away completely, but it tends to soften. We tend to act our way into new ways of feeling rather than feel our way into new ways of acting. Right? Sometimes we might think, shouldn't use feel there, we might think we are being hypocritical if we're acting loving when we don't feel it. No, you're being a disciple, right? Don't say, it's not authentic if I don't feel it. If you intend to do it, it is authentic. And be authentic in admitting the fact, my heart isn't here yet, like my feelings aren't there. I see nothing hypocritical about saying, you know what, I have trouble feeling good about this situation, but I'm determined to act in a good way towards those who, in my estimation, don't deserve it. I'm not being hypocritical. I'm not pretending something I'm not. I'm doing something in contrast to how I feel. And I had better do that, because if I live out my feelings, I don't know about you, you won't like me if I live out all my feelings. Because I'll be mean to people, and I shouldn't be, right? All sorts of, about emotions, I say, they arise uninvited in our hearts. I never invite anger in. It just pops up. And judgmental thoughts, that just kind of sneaks in. It's not like I went out and sought it, right? But I don't need to say, well, to be authentic, I must live out these things because they've arrived in my consciousness. No, I need to say, that is not the person I want to authentically be and how I want to authentically live. And so I admit those thoughts, those feelings. I don't try and pretend they're not there. I admit them to myself and to others if necessary. But I strive to do differently. And what I strive to do is truly, I think, who I can be by the grace of God. In all of this, Jesus says, and God is faithful, right? That God rewards. That God takes note of our even faulty efforts to be loving in a world full of hatred and division, ideologically, racially, in all sorts of manners. I mean, the list is endless. I could start listing all the ways, according to class, according to race, according to education, sexism, whatever, according to people whose sexuality doesn't fit my own or whatever. Our world is so filled with all of that kind of division and enmity that we need to really look for what Jesus is saying when he says the way to overcome it is with love, and that's the way of God. himself, and he rewards that. He takes note of that, and he says, well done, when we attempt it. So that is my prayer for us. May the words of Jesus continue to inspire and instill in us a desire to overcome through love.